Vasıf.
You're welcome.
All right, so it's a great honor to be able to give this talk, and especially wonderful to see several colleagues from the Troy excavations in the audience. I've had the good fortune over the course of the last 30 years of working at both Troy and Gordion. So what I will try to do today is to explain or to present to you what I regard as our principal conclusions from the Troy project between 1988 and 2012, and my recent work at Gordion from 2013 until the present. I think everyone in this audience is aware of the locations of Troy and Gordion. Troy in the Troad in what is now northwestern Turkey, Gordion in west central Turkey, about an hour's drive southwest of Ankara. And the two sites actually have a lot in common. Both are multi-period sites encompassing over 4,000 years of habitation, with 9 or 10 settlements, one built on top of the other, spanning a period from the early Bronze Age through the medieval period. Both are also, of course, associated with famous historical characters from mythology. Troy, of course, with the Homeric legends, and Gordion, of course, with King Midas of the Golden Touch. You're seeing the citadel mound of Troy on the left, as it looked at the beginning of our excavations in the late 1980s, and then an aerial shot of Gordion on the right, as it looked in 2013 when I took over as director. So let me start with Troy and then move into the Gordion project. So with Troy, obviously there have been a number of notorious and noteworthy teams who have worked there over the course of the last 140 years, beginning with Schliemann in 1870, continuing with Carl Blegen of the University of Cincinnati, whom you see in upper right. Then Manfred Korfmann and I between 1988 and 2005, at which point his position was taken over by Ernst Pernitzka, and now, of course, with Rustem Aslan over the course of the last 7 years. If I ask myself what are the most important results from the 25 years that we worked at Troy, going chronologically through those discoveries, I would say some are geographical. We were able to present a more complete, more nuanced environmental reconstruction of the area around Troy. And you're seeing here an aerial view of the citadel mound in the center of the image. And then a plan presented by our geologist Ilhan Kayan, showing that at the time in which Troy was founded, there was a lagoon that moved in about 6 kilometers from the Dardanelles to the site of Troy, thus offering protection for any sailors who were navigating the area. And so when you look at an aerial view of Troy now, you see how flat the area is to the north and to the west of the mounds. That's because it was originally water 5,000 years ago. And so the site of Troy had a much more commanding, much more strategic significance at the time of its foundation. And in the aerial view, you're of course seeing the Dardanelles to the north of the area that is so flat, and then the Gallipoli Peninsula beyond that. And I'll take you back to Gallipoli a little later. With the second city of Troy in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, you see here a reconstruction of what we think the site looked like at that time, what we think the citadel looked like at that time, with 2 stone-paved ramps leading into the city, one of which still survives. And you see the strength of the fortification wall around the most important buildings of the city, a mixture of limestone and mud brick, about 5 meters high and nearly 4 meters thick. For a long time, it was felt that that was the only protection for the most important buildings of the city. But as a consequence of magnetic prospection in the area of the lower city of Troy, so the area directly south of the citadel mound, we excavated down to the bedrock under the Hellenistic and Roman houses of the lower city. And in the bedrock, we discovered cuttings for a wooden palisade wall. We didn't recognize it for what it was at the time in which it was found. It was initially dated to the Troy 6 or the late Bronze Age, but further examination of the pottery in the cuttings in the bedrock for the wooden palisade proved that it was early Bronze Age in date. So you will see here, again, the slide I was showing you just before, the bedrock into which the cuttings for the wooden palisade were made, an elevation of what the construction of that wooden palisade would have looked like, and then a reconstruction on lower right of the palisade, so that if one were attempting to attack the city in the middle of the third millennium, one had to cope with two lines of defense. So a wooden palisade that protected a good bit of the lower city, perhaps all of the lower city, and then the stone and mud brick fortification walls around the principal buildings of the citadel mound. I should say that determining the circuit, determining the size and the scope of the wooden palisade wall is something that will have to be determined by future archaeologists at Troy. The problem with digging that palisade wall is that it lies under Hellenistic and Roman houses. Those Hellenistic and Roman houses are filled with pottery. And so to process all of the material above the bedrock takes decades. And so we were reluctant to dig up much of the wooden palisade wall, the early Bronze Age levels, because of what it meant in terms of processing the Hellenistic and Roman material directly above it. So this is something that I assume with the passage of time and with better remote sensing technologies, we'll be able to determine the circuit of that wooden palisade wall without the necessity of actually excavating all of those Hellenistic and Roman houses that lie directly above it. And of course, it's understandable that there would be such formidable protections for the settlement, given the valuables that were kept within the citadel mound, the most prominent of which are the so-called treasures of Priam, dating to about 2400 BC, more or less the same date as the royal tombs of Ur, which we have in the Penn Museum. And you're of course seeing Sophia Schliemann on the left, and some of the material from the so-called treasure of Priam at the right, with of course the famous lapis lazuli axe in upper right. For the late Bronze Age, there were far more important discoveries that were made between 1988 and 2012. I'm showing you on the upper part of the slide, the color phase plan that we put together in the early 1990s, trying to combine all of the walls, buildings, and streets that had been found by Schliemann, Blagan, and by us for the first time within the course of a single plan. You're seeing what survives of the late Bronze Age fortification walls, the Troy 6 fortification walls at lower left, and then our reconstruction of them at lower right, with a height of over 10 meters and a thickness of roughly 5 meters. So more or less double the protection that was offered by the early Bronze Age fortifications. In order to determine more about the strata and structures of the lower city, we subjected the entire area to magnetic prospection over the course of about a decade. And so in this aerial view, you're seeing, if you can follow my cursor, the citadel mound of Troy on upper right, with the Schliemann trench, the enormous trench dug by Schliemann in the 1870s to the center of the mound. And then I've outlined the area of the lower city that was prospected magnetically. And you see Stefan Giese, partner of Christian Hubner, on lower right. They did all of the they did much of the magnetic prospection at Troy and all of it at Gordion. So you'll be seeing more of them. In prospecting this area, what we were able to determine was the street plan for the Roman city, for the Hellenistic and Roman city. So you're seeing the same images at the top and the bottom. but with the magnetic perspection results superimposed on the lower city at the bottom. You can see the grid streets of the city, the orthogonal streets of the Hellenistic and Roman settlement very clearly at the bottom. You can also make out, if you look very carefully, the actual plans of the Roman buildings that were constructed there, primarily in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC. What was especially interesting for the late Bronze Age settlement is that in digging down to bedrock, there was a ditch that was discovered. You see here the excavator of the ditch on lower right, Peter Jablonka, standing within it. So as you can see, it's about life size in terms of height. And it looked as if it probably stretched throughout the perimeter, the southern perimeter of the lower city. And so over the course of the next few years, every place you see one of these black circles, we dug sondages intending to determine whether or not the ditch, which we thought was probably a defensive ditch, completely encircling the lower city in the late Bronze Age, in fact, did extend around the perimeter of that settlement. Every place we dug, we discovered part of the ditch, which seemed to have been continuous with a few areas for pathways through it. So you'll see in upper left, I've given you a black square and then enlarged the area that we excavated, where we have the ditch and we have some faint cuttings for a fortification wall on the inside of it. You're seeing on the right side, sorry, the ditch that I'm showing you on lower left. So you can see the ditch here, and then to the side of it with this gateway moving through the ditch, although the walls that you're seeing here are Hellenistic indeed. You'll notice how close to the surface the bedrock is. We're in the late Bronze Age and we're half a meter below the modern surface level, which tells you something about the massive erosion that's occurred in the lower city over time. Now, this is not without its problems, this allegedly defensive ditch that completely encircled the perimeter of the lower city. From what we can tell in terms of the ceramics that were excavated within it, it was dug at the same time in which much of the late Bronze Age fortification walls around the Citadel Mound were built. That's to say, 14th century BC, with continual repairs and extensions thereafter. The question is it defensive? I'm of the opinion that it is. Manfred Korfmann was certain that it was. Many of you in the audience will remember that Manfred Korfmann had a colleague at the University of Tübingen, Frank Kolb, who was convinced that it wasn't a defensive ditch. With a defensive ditch, one normally has a defensive wall on the interior side of the ditch. We don't have wonderful evidence for that. I'm not sure if you can see it, but on the right side, you see a narrow cutting on the interior side of the ditch, cut in the bedrock for a wall, but a very thin wall, not the kind of fortification wall that you would expect. For example, in Republican Rome with the Serbian walls, or really almost anywhere else, you have really phenomenally strong fortification walls on the interior sides of these defensive ditches. Here, we don't have it. I suspect it was once there. Manfred was convinced that, as he put it, my Hellenistic and Roman architects had taken all the stones of that defensive wall between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. I'm not certain that's the case, but I don't have a ready answer for why we seem to be missing a defensive wall on the interior side of the ditch. As you see it reconstructed on lower left, by Manfred Korfmann, you have these narrow wooden walls with thick earthen embankments behind them. It's conceivable that that was the original installation. Again, I expect that archaeologists of the future will be able to refine this far better than we have been able to do. When this discovery was made, it excited a lot of people, especially the philologists, because of the passages in the Iliad that refer to defensive ditches. in this case, encircling the Greek camp during the Trojan War. All of these ditches are deep, they're phenomenally strong with stakes set inside it. So there were some who felt that Homer had actually seen Troy and had described the defensive ditches. And that's why they ended up in the Iliad. This is clearly not the case. Those ditches were filled long before the time of Homer. And it's not as if Troy is the only late Bronze Age settlement or early Iron Age settlement with a defensive ditch. One finds these all over Anatolia and the Levant during the late Bronze and early Iron Age. We have one at Gordion. Almost everywhere you would look, you would find one. It's not surprising that there was one at Troy too. But it was a major discovery, and I expect it will be refined as excavations continue. Only one piece of writing was ever, of Bronze Age date, was ever found at Troy. This biconvex bronze seal with Luvian script on both sides, giving the name of a man identified as a scribe and the name of a woman, conceivably his wife, on the other side. This tells us nothing about the history of Troy in the late Bronze Age, but the discovery did occur at a time when Hittite geography was being much more clearly understood, and at a time when it was felt that Wilusa could conclusively be viewed as the Hittite word for Ilion. I don't know anyone who doubts that at this point. There may be one or two somewhere in the world, but Wilusa has generally been accepted now as the Hittite word for Ilion, as Ahiyawa in the Hittite texts of Boazkoi has been accepted as the Hittite word for the Achaeans or the Mycenaean Greeks. And so with that, we can reconstruct what was happening at Troy in the late Bronze Age between roughly 1400 and 1200 BC. And for that matter, what was happening in Western Asia Minor in general. So we have references to an Ahiyawan or Mycenaean Greek commander with 100 chariots named Atarisia, who is attacking Western Asia Minor in the early 14th century. He is usually viewed as either Atreus or an ancestor of the later Atreus, but Atarisia is viewed by most as a Hittite word for the Greek Atreus. We also have a treaty between Alexander, ruler of Wilusa in the early 13th century, and the Hittite king Muwatalli II. So clearly Muwatalli II was concerned about ensuring that the western flank of the Hittite Empire, the vassal states of the Hittite Empire, were firmly in allegiance with the Hittite king as he prepared to fight the Battle of Kadesh in the Levant. Alexander was an interesting name in itself because it is a Greek name. Of course, Alexander was the Hittite word for the Greek Alexandros. And so some have wondered if Alexandros or Alexandru, ruler of Wilusa in the early 13th century, is the son of a dynastic marriage between a Mycenaean or a Thracian or Macedonian or Mycenaean parent and an Anatolian parent. This also deserves additional scholarly scrutiny, but it is a very unusual name for a ruler of a Western Asia Minor vassal state in the late Bronze Age. Of course, we also get Apollonius, usually viewed in the Alexandru Treaty, viewed as an Anatolian version of Apollo. And in a later tablet, the so-called Tawagalawa tablet in the mid-13th century, Tawagalawa viewed as the Hittite word for the Greek Eteocles, reference to armed conflict, it seems, between the Anatolians or the Hittites and the Mycenaean Greeks that involved Wilusa in some way in the middle of the 13th century. And then finally reference to a king of Wilusa named Walmu, who has been thrown out of Wilusa by his fellow citizens. So there's a civil war, some sort of Trojan Spring around 1220 BC, and Walmu clearly is a pro-Hittite ruler, and Tutalias IV is interested in seeing him return to the throne of Wilusa. So why was Walmu thrown out of Wilusa? Was it because of his pro-Hittite sympathies? And did the town subscribe to a different political point of view? We don't have any clear answers for this. But again, all of the discovery of the Luvian seal, the discovery of the ditch, caused people, I think, to view Troy and Wilusa in a broader West Anatolian and Central Anatolian context than had been the case before that. Of course, the discoveries of Koroblagan at Pylos have also been extremely important in understanding late Bronze Age Western Asia Minor and Wilusa in particular. Blagan excavated at the Mycenaean Palace of Pylos after his work at Troy between 1932 and 1938. And he found a cache of linear bead tablets, an early form of Greek. And in one of the tablets was a list of the women who had been seized from the western coast of Asia Minor or the islands off the western coast of Asia Minor at the end of the 13th century and brought to Pylos to work in the textile industry. So this also has given rise to speculation. If you have women seized as commodities in Western Asia Minor and taken across the Aegean to a Mycenaean palace in Greece, did you have the reverse? A woman in Greece seized by Anatolians and taken across the Aegean to an Anatolian palace? Again, there's no answer to this, but all of these have brought forward suggested links between the Homeric tradition and the late Bronze Age historical record, many of which you can see presented in Mary Bakvarova's book on the Anatolian tradition and the Homeric legends, which came out a few years ago. Over time, the residents of Troy recognized that regardless of the historicity of the Trojan War, they could sell themselves as the residents of the place where the Trojan War had occurred and attract high-profile tourists as a consequence. And so the landscape around Troy was Homerized. It was turned into a kind of Homeric Disneyland. So abandoned settlements, ruined settlements that looked like tumuli were turned into the tombs of the Greek and Trojan heroes who had fought during the Trojan War, Protesilaos, Ajax, Achilles. You're seeing the alleged tumulus of Achilles in lower right. And this did, in fact, attract high-profile tourists. Xerxes on his way to fight the Greeks during the Persian Wars, Alexander on his way to fight the Persians during the Macedonian Wars. And we excavated the tumulus of Achilles in 1999 and 2000. You're seeing, of course, Alexander on upper left from the famous Alexander mosaic at Pompeii, and an aerial view of the tumulus of Achilles at the right. What we found was that there were repeated attempts to rob the tumulus of Achilles by the Definegi lair, by the tomb robbers. And so we decided if we didn't dig it ourselves, it would be plundered. We did dig it in 1999 and 2000, and we found that at the base of it was a Neolithic settlement, and that the area above it had been monumentalized in the 3rd century BC. In other words, it was a creation of the tourism industry at Troy in the early Hellenistic period because it was believed to be the tomb of Achilles. And so they built it up to a level that would be appropriate for the status of the man who was allegedly buried in the tumulus. And so, as I say, the entire area was turned into a kind of Homeric Disneyland in order to attract high-profile tourists. And of course, by 300 BC, the Romans had acknowledged their Trojan ancestry. And so we begin getting monuments to the Romans and eventually to the emperors themselves once the empire begins. These are 2 discoveries from the Agora at Troy, Augustus on the left and Hadrian at the right. And there were plenty of other dedications to the Roman emperors too, who were presented as sumgenes, kinsmen of the Romans, courtesy of the genealogical juggling that the Romans had done at the end of the 4th century BC, wherein they were made descendants of the Trojans. Now, Gordion is a very different kind of site, although, as I said, it also possesses 9 or 10 settlements, one built on top of the other, as well as a very complex excavation history. It was discovered in 1900 during the construction of the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad and subsequently excavated by the Penn Museum beginning in 1950 under Rodney Young, whom you see on upper left, looking sort of like an archaeological cowboy, and then continuing after his death under the jurisdiction of Keith DeVries, and then Ken Sams and Mary Voigt. And I assumed direction of the site in 2013. The first thing I did was to try to put together all the walls, buildings, and streets found by all of us in a color phase plan. So using the same sort of technique that we had used at Troy. And what you're seeing in the color phase plan at lower right are all of the Phrygian levels of occupation at Gordion from the 10th century to the 4th century BC. Now, who were the Phrygians? The Phrygians came, according to both archaeological evidence and ancient literary testimony, in the 12th century BC from the Balkans, from southeastern Europe. Many believe, based on ceramic discoveries, that some crossed the Bosphorus and gradually made their way to Gordion. Others crossed the Dardanelles and settled at Troy. And so, in a way, the Phrygians and the Trojans, at least as of the Iron Age, were kinsmen. And so I really do consider myself lucky to have had the opportunity to dig in both places. The question is, did the migrants from the Balkans come only in the 12th century BC, or did they move into the Gallipoli Peninsula earlier? And many of you are familiar with the discoveries of Göksel Sazca at Midos on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where he has found architectural terracottas with parallels from the Balkans dating to the 14th and 13th centuries BC. So it may be that the Phrygians, if we can call them that, began to move into the Gallipoli Peninsula and maybe further into Thrace than we had realized already at the end of the Bronze Age, prior to the 12th century, even though there's no evidence for their arrival at Gordion and in Phrygia until the 12th century. Now, you're seeing on the left an aerial view of Gordion. On the right, again, the color phase plan. And the Phrygian settlements have been divided into 3 parts, which is what archaeologists like to do, divide everything into trilogies. So early Phrygian from the mid-10th century to a monumental fire in 800 BC. The middle Phrygian from the period immediately after that monumental fire, 800 BC, until the arrival of the Persians in the 540s, so about 250 years. This is the period of Midas, who ruled probably between 740 and 700 BC. And then the late Phrygian period, which is synonymous with the Akiminid or Persian period from 540 until Alexander's arrival at the site in 333. Gordion's citadel mound was surrounded by tumuli, the earliest tumuli for which we have evidence in Anatolia. The first monumental tumulus is built in 850 BC, and over the course of time, there are over 125 royal tumuli that surround the site. You can see these fields of tumuli in the upper left. The largest of the tumuli was the so-called Midas Mound, probably built by Midas or his father Gordius in 740 BC, which you see on left of center. And then you're seeing on the right the citadel mound in orange of Gordion, Tumulus MM in yellow, the excavated tumuli in green, and the unexcavated tumuli in purple. So there are many unexcavated tumuli at Gordion. As it stands now, we've excavated or rather 45 have been explored in one way or another, some by our excavation, some by the tomb robbers, but about 45 dug, and about 80 more that have been unexplored. So there is plenty to learn going forward. As one approached the citadel mound of Gordion in the mid-9th century BC, one first encountered the citadel gate, the east citadel gate of early Phrygian Gordion, built in 850 BC and built in such a way that anyone leaving the citadel had their eyes directed toward Tumulus W, the oldest of the burial mounds at Gordion, also dating to 850 BC. So you can see here I've tried to indicate the connection between citadel and landscape. It may be that this kind of connection between the architecture of the citadel and the surrounding landscape is more common than we think. But what is inescapable is that they clearly wanted to establish a connection between the first monumental building one saw on the citadel mound of Gordion and the first of the royal tumuli in the area. Now, who's building this monumental tumulus? In a way, it's the Phrygians, although the Phrygians are coming to Gordion in the late 12th century, and we don't have monumental construction on the citadel until the 9th century. So this has always been a question. Why is it that several hundred years pass before the citadel is monumentalized? And we don't have a clear answer to that. But at some point between 875 and 850, Gordion changed appearance from a rather sleepy settlement, small with mud brick houses, to a monumental citadel with high fortification walls, the monumental gate building that you see in front of you, the height of which was probably 16 meters, even higher than what we have at Troy, and monumental royal tombs that began to surround the settlement. This is all happening more or less suddenly in the second quarter of the 9th century BC. We've tried to focus on the conservation of that citadel gate on the east side of the citadel because it was damaged somewhat during the earthquake that struck north central Turkey in 1999 with the epicenter at Izmit. Many of you lived through that. I remember being at Troy when it happened, and our beds moved across the cabins during the course of the earthquake. But the stones of the citadel gate were partially dislodged and partially fractured by the earthquake. So we've devoted the last 6 years to stabilizing the gate, removing the upper 12 courses of stone of the gate, consolidating the stones, and then returning them to their original position, anchoring the facade, the stone facade of the gate to the stone rubble behind it with steel straps, as you see on lower right. So if you come to Gordion today, this is what you'll see. We finished in 2019. So the masonry of the gate still stands intact to a height of 10 meters. And you'll notice what we've done with the upper section of the gate. We developed a technique called soft capping. When we complete the conservation of a wall, we surround the perimeter of the upper section with a mud brick frame. Within that mud brick frame, we plant shallow rooted grasses called poa. The roots of the grasses will grow deep enough to absorb the excess water during the rainy season, preventing the water from moving into the masonry, but the roots don't grow deep enough to disturb the stability of the stones underneath it. So it's a kind of green solution, green capping, or soft capping as we call it, that has worked very well for us. We've used this for all of the conserved walls and gates throughout the citadel. As I said, the citadel more or less springs up suddenly in the second quarter of the 9th century BC. And if we look at the most important buildings, they can be divided into two parts. On the east side, the outer and inner court, which contains Megarons, These were not palaces, but megarons that were intended probably for diplomatic purposes. If you were the ambassador from Assyria or Lydia, this is probably where you would have come. And then next to it, an industrial sector or terrace building with 16 identical buildings, which were primarily focused on weaving and on cooking or food preparation. Some of the megarons where you would have been entertained as an ambassador were elaborately decorated. You see here in the second Megaron, Megaron 2, what we have always considered to be the oldest decorated stone mosaic floor in the world, dating to 825 BC. There has recently been another discovery, also in Turkey, dating to a slightly earlier period, and they claim to have the earliest decorated stone mosaic in the world, but this is certainly one of the earliest decorated stone mosaics in the world, dating to 825 BC. And you're seeing it in situ in the Megaron in upper left, with the hearth in the center, a 2-meter hearth, 2 meters in diameter, and then a watercolor that was produced of the stone mosaic floor at the time in which it was excavated, which is the 1950s. And as you see, it looks as if you have a series of carpets, each laid on the floor with a slightly different orientation, but all with different geometric designs. So it seems to be a stone reproduction of the kinds of carpets that would have been woven next door in the terrace building or the industrial sector. And we have steadily been conserving the panels of this mosaic floor. You see one of them on lower right that has been fully conserved. These are, of course, pebble mosaics, and so they're a nightmare to conserve. It's been taking us longer than we expected. This same building contained a stone Acroterion, as you see on upper right, the earliest stone Acroterion that's ever been discovered, far earlier than anything in Greece. These megarons were enormous. So here I've tried to indicate the size of them. You see on upper right, a reconstruction of the largest of the megarons, number 3, with a length of nearly 20 meters, a width of 15 meters, and a height of over 12 meters. If you were to come to the Penn Museum and go into the Upper Egyptian Gallery, which I've shown you on lower right, that's about the size of the interior of one of these megarons. They were gigantic and elaborately decorated, not just with pebble mosaic floors, but also with textiles. Fortunately for us, not for the people of Gordion in 800 BC, the buildings burned down and the textile decoration were preserved within the destruction level. So we have, over time, tried to disentangle the clumps of textiles that were found on the burned floors of the megarons, burned in the fire of 800 BC, and reconstruct what the textile decorations looked like. These two were elaborately decorated, as you see on lower left, with geometric designs, similar kinds of geometric designs that you see in the pebble mosaic floor or the ceramics of Gordion, or for that matter, in the royal furniture of Gordion. I'm showing you the wooden serving stands excavated in the Midas Mound tumulus on upper right, although those are somewhat later in date. Now, this fire was originally, and you see here the scope of the fire in 800 BC, encompassing some of the megarons and the entire terrace building. Each of those terrace buildings had 2 hearths. So the fire probably broke out there, perhaps during food preparation or some other industrial activity. Rodney, and you see us excavating the terrace building with the destruction level of 800 BC in place on the right side. When Rodney Young excavated this area, he believed that the destruction dated to 700 BC and was the result of a Cimmerian attack on Gordion. As a consequence of over the course of the last 20 years, new dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating, we've been able to demonstrate that the destruction level dates to 800 BC, was not the result of an enemy attack, but probably a fire that got out of control, in late August. We can tell from the seeds that were excavated in the terrace building that the fire occurred in late summer. So it's likely that there was a spark or a fire that the winds grabbed hold of and quickly spread through the citadel mound. No reason to ascribe that to an enemy attacker. We've all seen fires that have gotten out of control in Turkey in late summer. We saw it this summer in 2021, also in Greece. And of course, these fires are famous. I remember working at Troy. They occurred all the time on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where of course there are such lush forests. It's not surprising that one would occur at Gordion in 800 BC. After its occurrence, the residents of Gordion did not go through the ruined buildings looking for valuables. Instead, they piled 5 meters of clay on top of the ruined city and built a new, what we call Middle Phrygian city, early 8th century BC, above the old early Phrygian city. And so that sealed all of the material from the early Phrygian settlement, the late 9th century settlement, in place for Rodney Young to find it in the 1950s. The new city that was built, you see it on the right side, and the early Phrygian on the left side, basically copied the city plan of early Phrygian Gordion, although there was more space between the buildings. You can compare the terrace building on the left slide with the terrace buildings on the right slide. With this new organization, it meant that if one of the terrace buildings caught on fire, it would be less likely to spread to the surrounding buildings. So it was probably done with fire prevention in mind. Here you have a reconstruction of what we think Middle Phrygian Gordion looked like, at least in the 8th century BC. And this is courtesy of magnetic perspection, and with thanks to Stefan Giese and Christian Hubner, who also did our remote sensing at Troy. So you have a citadel mound with a lower town or a lower city to the north and south, another residential district, the outer town to the west, and at least 3 forts on the north, Kuştepe, on the southeast, Küçükkuyu, which has been completely excavated, and a new fort discovered via remote sensing on the western side of the outer town. Why would they do this at Gordion? Why would they completely bury all of the buildings that they had just spent 60 years building on the citadel mound and build a new city from scratch, 5 meters higher? We need to keep in mind what was happening at the other centers of power in Anatolia and the Near East. Sky-high citadels in Urartu, at Carchemish, Zingerli, etc., in southeastern Asia Minor, and then of course the great Assyrian palaces in what is now northern Iraq. There was tremendous competition among each of these centers of power to present to the visitor a more powerful configuration of architecture and defense. And that seems to have been one of the principal ideas on the minds of the builders of Middle Phrygian Gordion in the early 8th century. When they built this new city, what did the Megarons look like? It's likely that they looked like the Megarons in Midas City. Many of you are familiar with Midas City, which lies to the west of Gordion, where one sees reconstructions, reproductions of Phrygian Megarons carved in the rock in the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries BC. The most famous of these, of course, is the Midas Monument, which I'm showing you on lower right. The width of the Midas Monument is 17 meters, which is exactly the width of a Megaron at Gordion. And the reproductions of these Phrygian Megarons in Midas City are clearly reproductions of actual buildings. You can see the nails, the bolts, the crossbeams rendered in relief sculpture. And you can also see, of course, these Megarons with the same kind of acroteria that we find in stone in the Megarons of Gordion. So we have used this as a basis for suggesting what the facades of the Megarons at Gordion looked like. What I'm showing you here, of course, is the Midas monument at Midas City itself, but with the designs as they would have looked when the monument had just been carved, with the paint still present on the facade. And you're seeing the dedication to Midas as Wanox and Lawagetas in upper left. Again, we've used these facades to suggest what the facades of the Megarons at Gordion might have looked like. So with elaborate geometric facades or geometric decoration, that puts you in mind of the geometric decoration of the pebble mosaics and of the textiles, and for that matter, of the ceramics. Once we did this, I began to wonder whether or not the famous geometric temple models from Greece, from Argos and Pericora, are also reflecting the original geometric decoration of the walls and roofs that would have been in place in the 8th century BC. I've always thought that these were simply decorative motifs that were added to the temple models, but maybe they're copying something that one could have actually seen in the actual buildings. The most famous of the tumuli, as I mentioned, is the Midas Mound, constructed in 740 BC and probably for Midas's father by Midas himself. So it would have been the first of the constructions for which Midas was responsible. This was excavated by Rodney Young in 1957, and you see a cross-section of the mound, which at the time of its construction was the largest burial mound in Asia Minor with a height of 53 meters. It would remain the largest burial mound in Asia Minor for nearly 200 years until Croesus built the monument, the burial mound for his father Aliates in the early 6th century BC at Sardis. And he made that 15 meters higher, 69 meters in height. So that is now the highest burial mound in Anatolia. The Midas Mound is the second highest. But you see the cross-section with the tomb chamber inside. The Phrygians always used wood for their tomb chambers, and this is the oldest standing wooden building in the world, again, dating to 740 BC. You see the wooden tomb chamber in the upper section of the slide. And by accident, a few years ago, when our colleague Richard Liebhardt was examining one of the beams of the roof, he found 4 names inscribed in the beam: Nana, Mixos, Tsitsidos, and Serunis. I've shown you on lower left the incisions. These were done at the time of construction of the tomb chamber because they were inscribed on the ground and then added to the roof, and then a beam added in front of that. So they could only have been inscribed at the time of the funeral in 740 BC. What's interesting is that one of the names inscribed on the beam, Citadels, is also inscribed in wax on one of the bronze bowls from the interior of the Midas Mound tomb chamber. So at the time of the funeral, there were over 100 mourners. Each mourner brought his or her best bronze vessel from their pantry. That's why all the vessels look different. And then put a wax strip on the side, writing their name in the wax strip. So Tsitsidos, you can see on the left side, and you can also see that inscribed on the beam on lower right. Who these men were is hard to say. Were they the architects? Were they the men responsible for the funeral? We have no idea. It's likely that there were other inscribed beams for the other wooden tumuli or wooden tomb chambers at Gordion, but no one thought to look for them in the 1950s and 60s when they were being excavated. More of these will no doubt be found in the future. We analyzed a few years ago the shroud that was covering the body in the burial chamber. And what we found is that the shroud was coated with an inorganic pigment called goethite, which gave it a golden color. And you see that on lower left and lower center. We have since found that goethite this golden dye was used for all of the textiles of the aristocrats at Gordion. So this may be the source of the story of the golden touch. We don't have a lot of gold at Gordion, but maybe the story doesn't derive from objects. Maybe it's tied to the textiles of the people of Gordion, the aristocrats looking golden because of this golden dye of their textiles as they walk through the streets of the city. Gordion and Phrygia, of course, were very strong at the time in which the Iliad was written down. You see very strong references or very evocative references to the strength of Gordion and of Phrygia in the Iliad, where it's described as phenomenally strong with hordes of strong soldiers standing on the banks of the Sangarius River, the river that runs past Gordion. And I think this is probably a reflection of what Gordion looked like during the reign of Midas, who was on the throne when the Iliad was written down for the first time. So the references to Phrygia in the Iliad don't reflect what Gordion looked like in the late Bronze Age. Gordion looked like nothing in the late Bronze Age, but it does reflect what the city looked like when the Iliad was written down in the late 8th century. And one can imagine that tales of the Trojan War and Phrygia's role in that war were sung to visitors when they came to the Megarons of Gordion in the 8th century BC. We have some vessels from tombs, such as this one from Tumulus J at Gordion, that show a lyre player at Gordion. And we also have tortoise shell lyres that have been discovered at Gordion. So you see one of these tortoiseshell lyres in drawing in the center at the bottom, and then one being conserved at the right. So one can imagine musicians, lyre players, singing of Homeric tales and of Phrygia's role in those Homeric wars during the Iron Age, when ambassadors would come to visit the court of King Midas. I'm imagining the same sort of thing that one sees in the late Bronze Age frescoes of Pylos, where you again have musicians who are also probably singing heroic narratives and of the role of Pylos in those wars about which the musicians are singing. I wanted to end by highlighting two areas where we've recently conducted considerable excavation. The south gate of the city, which is newly discovered, and the center of the Citadel Mound. The south gate is a completely new find. We excavated there hoping to find the beginning of a street that cut through the Citadel Mound. We did not find that, but what we did find was an entirely new Citadel gate with the longest approach road for a Citadel gate that has ever been found, longer than 65 meters. You can see a color phase plan of the gate that I've given you in the upper section of the slide, first built in 850 BC at the same time as the East Citadel Gate, middle of the 9th century, and still in use in the late Roman period in the 4th century AD. So it's a citadel gate that's in use for at least 1200 years. The early Phrygian walls of the gate, which were built to last and were still in use during the late Roman period. You see here on the left, one of the stepped glacis that support the fortification walls on one side of the approach road. You see here one of the early 8th century walls of the approach road, and you see how good the masonry is for the early 8th century BC. If we didn't have it in context, I would have dated this to the 6th century BC. And you're also seeing the Gordian architects' love of color. With some of these fortification walls, they used a variety of different quarries, each one producing stone of a different color. So the whole city would have seemed polychromatic as you approached it. And that was true for the buildings and for the roofing systems as well. When we dug in the center of the mound, area 4, we found a pit that contained the entire roof of a building of early 6th century BC date. Here you see some of the elaborate terracotta tiles that decorated the roof and the upper section of the walls, the same sorts of tiles that one sees in early 6th century BC Sardis, which is no surprise because Lydia had extended its control over Gordion and over Phrygia by the early 6th century BC. You see a reconstruction of one of these roofing systems from Gordion in lower right. In excavating the so-called Mosaic building, and this is in 2019, we thought that this building, like Rodney Young, was Persian period in date. So it was often called the Akiminid Mosaic building and believed to date to the early 5th century BC. It was elaborately decorated with mosaic floors, pebble mosaic floors in meander pattern, such as you see on upper right. And it's just above the south gate, the complex that I have just shown you. Here you see in more detail those mosaic floors, again, meander pattern all through the complex with equally elaborate terracotta architectural decoration for the roof and upper walls. In the course of our excavation, we found enough ceramics to show that it dates 100 years earlier than we thought. So rather than being an early 5th century mosaic building, it is an early 6th century BC mosaic building, not attributable to the period of Persian control, but to the period of Lydian control in the early 6th century BC, and almost certainly the residence of the ruler of Gordion during the early 6th century BC. Within the trench, we found pieces of a breastplate, of an iron and bronze cuirass that had clearly been worn by one of Gordion's defenders during the period of the Persian attack in the 540s. You can see that the decoration in bronze is meander decoration, just like the floor decoration of the building. And just like the armor that Patroclus wears on the red figure cup by the Sosius painter, dated to 500 BC. You see the meander decoration here if you follow my cursor, and the same thing on the breastplate fragment that we found. So this dates more or less to the same period as the famous bronze and iron breastplate from the Dalion on Cyprus. We found this at the edge of the trench, and when we continue excavation next year, we hope that we'll find the rest of it. I wanted to show as my last slides a reference to the relevance of Troy in particular in the modern world. Sometimes, especially in America, we've found that it's easier for us to understand the wars in which we're currently involved, contemporary wars, by looking at those wars through the lens of antiquity, through the Trojan War in particular. So it's become easier for us to understand post-traumatic stress among the fighters in Iraq and Afghanistan by looking at post-traumatic stress experienced by the Homeric warriors on the battlefield of Troy. So we see books now called Achilles in Vietnam about trauma during the Trojan War and trauma in Vietnam. We see plays like Ajax in Iraq that brings together a fighter from the 21st century in Iraq with a fighter on the battlefield of Troy in the late Bronze Age. We see programs for veterans called Theater of War, where veterans, Army veterans, perform plays written about the Trojan War in the 5th century BC as a way of coming to grips, as a way of helping them understand the trauma that is a regular part of war. And of course, if one is sailing past the site of Troy through the Dardanelles next to Çanakkale, one also sees two monuments that summarize the history of this area's connection to war. the monumental wooden horse from the 2004 Warner Brothers film entitled Troy, the horse out of which the actor Brad Pitt climbed. This is on loan from Hollywood to Çanakkale as a reminder of the first of the great wars between East and West, the Trojan War, that occurred in this area. And of course, directly across from it is the Gallipoli Memorial, the monument to the last of the great wars between East and West that occurred in this area. And it also sort of summarizes the malleability of Troy and the Trojan tradition, as well as of Anatolia in general, alternately looking west or east or in both directions simultaneously, depending upon the prevailing political, social, and economic circumstances. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rose, for really this amazing talk, bringing us a real wide picture of Troy and Gordion on both sides, and perfectly wrapping it up with with the last examples. Amazing. Thank you very much. I realize that we almost have one or two colleagues from Turkey, so maybe we should just pass to the Q&A part. I'm sure there will be interesting questions from our colleagues. So we can have questions regarding the talk. You may type or raise hand and ask questions. Please, Trevor Watkins.
That was fascinating. Can I just take you back to Troy? I was very fortunate to visit Troy when Manfred Kaufmann had just discovered the late Bronze Age fortifications. Yeah, so I actually saw them live and then heard all about the controversies at Tübingen University. But you now have an early Bronze Age as well. What's the physical relationship between the early Bronze Age circuit and the late Bronze Age circuit?
Well, the early Bronze Age circuit, the wooden palisade, is about 200 meters to the south of the Citadel Mound. It's in the center of the lower city. The late Bronze Age defensive ditch, if I may call it that, is about 400 meters south of the Citadel Mound, so twice as far from the Citadel Mound as the early Bronze Age. And of course, I simplified the late Bronze Age fortifications. We don't just have one ditch of 14th century date. We also have a second ditch from the Troy 7A period that's about 100 meters to the south of the first one, which clearly was intended to expand the size of the lower city. So we have two defensive ditches, although the first one had gone out of use before the second one was built. But in short, we